My name is Dr. Von Kowalski, and I'm an anesthesiologist who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak in Chicago. When contaminated water turned my patients into monsters, I had to choose between my medical oath and saving my twin daughters. These are the impossible decisions that kept me alive when the world ended. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Von Kowalski, and 3 days ago I was just another anesthesiologist working the night shift at Metropolitan General Hospital in Chicago. People called me Patch because of my steady hands during surgery, and I thought the worst thing I'd ever have to deal with was keeping patients stable during trauma operations. I was wrong about everything. Let me start from the beginning, because if you're watching this, you need to understand exactly how fast the world can fall apart. It was July 15th, 2024, and we were in the middle of the worst heat wave Chicago had seen in decades. The temperature had been sitting at 98 degrees for a solid week, and the power grid was struggling to keep up with everyone running their air conditioners full blast. ComEd had been doing rolling blackouts across the city, trying to manage the demand, and we'd been dealing with the consequences at the hospital all week long. I remember being frustrated about the power situation because it was affecting our equipment calibration in the operating rooms. When you're responsible for keeping someone unconscious but alive during surgery, consistent power isn't just convenient. It's a matter of life and death. I'd been working at Metropolitan General for 15 years, specializing in trauma surgery anesthesia, and I'd never seen the infrastructure strain like this. The backup generators were running constantly, and I kept thinking about how fragile our whole system really was. My twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, had been staying with their mother across town for the summer. They were 14, and every night when I got home from my shift, I'd check my phone for their goodnight texts. Emma always sent me pictures of whatever they'd cooked for dinner, and Sophie would tell me about the books she was reading. They were my anchor to the normal world, the reason I could handle the stress of my job. I had no idea that within 72 hours, I'd be questioning whether I'd ever see them alive again. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 2 days before the outbreak really began. We started getting an unusual number of patients in the emergency department, all presenting with similar symptoms: severe stomach cramps, high fever, nausea, and this strange agitation that didn't respond normally to our standard treatments. I remember Dr. Williams from pediatrics mentioning that she'd never seen children react to fever reducers the way these kids were reacting. They'd get the medication, their temperature would drop slightly, but they'd become more restless, not less. What struck me as odd was the demographic spread. We had construction workers, office employees, entire families, people from all different neighborhoods across the city. The only common factor seemed to be that they were all drinking tap water regularly. In that heat, everyone was drinking more water than usual, trying to stay hydrated. The CDC had issued some reports about waterborne illness outbreaks in Detroit and Milwaukee, but we'd gotten those kinds of warnings before. Food poisoning, contaminated wells in rural areas, the usual summer health advisories. None of us took it seriously enough. I should have been paying closer attention to the medication requirements. These patients needed higher doses of everything: pain medication, sedatives, even anesthetics during procedures. It was like their nervous systems were running on overdrive, but we chalked it up to the heat and stress. I administered propofol to a construction worker for a minor surgery, and I had to increase the dosage by 30% just to get him under. His pupils stayed dilated even after he was unconscious, which should have been impossible. When I mentioned it to the attending physician, he just shrugged and said the heat was making everyone's body chemistry act strange. The night everything changed started like any other shift. I came in at 7 in the evening, checked on my assigned patients, reviewed the surgical schedule, and settled into what I thought would be a routine 12 hours. The hospital felt different that night, though. There was this underlying tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. The nurses were more on edge than usual, and I noticed that security had been called to the emergency department 3 times already, and my shift had barely started. At around 9:30, we lost main power to the entire hospital. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but we were operating on limited capacity. All non-essential systems went dark, and we had to prioritize which equipment stayed online. The pharmacy's electronic locks switched to manual mode, which meant we had to physically key into the medication storage areas. I remember thinking at the time that this was just another inconvenience in an already stressful week, but that backup power failure would later save my life. Mrs. Chen had been working the pediatric ward for 12 years when I first met her. She was one of those nurses who could calm down the most frightened child with just her voice, and she had this reputation for never losing her temper, even during the most chaotic situations. Over the past 2 days, she'd been complaining about stomach problems and had been drinking water constantly. She'd mentioned feeling feverish, but she kept working because we were understaffed due to other people calling in sick with similar symptoms. I was making my rounds, checking on post-operative patients, when I realized I hadn't seen Mrs. Chen for over an hour. The pediatric ward was unusually quiet, which should have been my first warning. When kids are in pain or scared, they make noise. Silence in a children's hospital ward is never a good sign. I went looking for her, thinking maybe she'd finally gone home sick or was taking a break in one of the staff rooms. I found her in the supply closet on the 3rd floor. The door was slightly open, which was against protocol because we kept controlled medications in there. I pushed it open, expecting to find her organizing supplies or maybe taking a moment to rest. Instead, I found her crouched over Jimmy Rodriguez, our night janitor. Jimmy was a good man, father of 3, who'd been working at the hospital for 8 years. He was always friendly, always willing to help out when we needed something cleaned up quickly between surgeries. What I saw in that supply closet changed everything I thought I knew about medicine and human nature. Mrs. Chen had her back to me, and Jimmy was on the floor beneath her. Her scrubs were torn and covered in blood, and she was making these sounds that weren't quite human but weren't animal either. Something in between that made every instinct in my body scream that I was looking at something fundamentally wrong. My medical training kicked in automatically. I called her name, expecting her to turn around, expecting to find some medical explanation for what I was seeing. When she did turn around, her face was covered in blood, but that wasn't what made me step backward. It was her eyes. Her pupils were completely dilated, like she was under deep anesthesia, but she was moving and responding to stimuli. In 15 years of administering anesthetics, I'd never seen anything like it. I reached for Jimmy's wrist to check his pulse, which was pure medical instinct, but when I touched his arm, I realized that there wasn't enough left of him to save. Mrs. Chen had torn through his uniform with her fingernails, which had somehow become sharp enough to cut through fabric and skin like surgical instruments. The wounds were unlike anything I'd seen in trauma surgery. They weren't clean cuts or typical bite marks. They were ragged tears, like something had been trying to get inside him rather than just attack him. When I tried to speak to Mrs. Chen, to get her to respond to her name or to any verbal commands, she just stared at me with those dilated pupils. Then she stood up, and I realized that whatever was looking back at me wasn't Mrs. Chen anymore. Her movements were different, more focused but less coordinated at the same time. She took a step toward me, and I made the first decision that would keep me alive for the next 3 days. I ran. I ran straight to the stairwell and didn't stop until I reached the roof access door. The hospital roof had always been my thinking place during difficult shifts. When I lost a patient or had to make a particularly hard decision, I'd come up there to clear my head and remember why I became a doctor in the first place. That night it became my vantage point for watching the world end. From 7 stories up, I could see across most of downtown Chicago. The rolling blackouts had left patches of the city in darkness, but there were fires starting to spread across the south side. Not just one or two building fires, but dozens of them, scattered across neighborhoods in a pattern that didn't make sense for accidental fires. I could see emergency vehicle lights moving through the streets, but there were too many incidents and not enough responders. My phone still had some battery life, and I managed to pick up an emergency broadcast signal. The automated message kept repeating the same information over and over. Avoid all tap water. Seek immediate medical attention if experiencing fever, nausea, or aggressive behavior. Martial law had been declared for Cook County. All residents should remain in their homes and await further instructions. But there was no medical attention left to seek. As I stood on that roof, listening to sirens in the distance and watching fires spread across my city, I realized that whatever had happened to Mrs. Chen was happening to people all over Chicago. The waterborne illness that we dismissed as just another summer health advisory had turned into something that was transforming people into something else entirely. I tried calling my ex-wife's house, where Emma and Sophie were staying, but the call wouldn't go through. The cell towers were either overloaded or down, and I couldn't get any signal beyond the emergency broadcast. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd seen and what it meant for everyone I cared about. My daughters were somewhere across the city, and I had no way to reach them or know if they were safe. The emergency broadcast message changed around midnight. Instead of telling people to seek medical attention, it started warning people to avoid anyone showing signs of aggressive behavior. It advised people to barricade themselves in secure locations and to avoid contact with infected individuals at all costs. The fact that they'd stopped calling them patients and started calling them infected told me everything I needed to know about how fast this situation was deteriorating. I made my first real decision of the outbreak while standing on that roof. I could either stay there and hope for rescue, or I could go back into the hospital, gather medical supplies, and try to make my way across the city to find my daughters. Every instinct I had as a father told me to start running toward them immediately. But my medical training told me that I needed to understand what I was dealing with first. The hospital had become a different place in the few hours since I'd fled to the roof. The normal sounds of medical equipment and staff conversations had been replaced by something much more disturbing. I could hear those same inhuman sounds that Mrs. Chen had been making, coming from different areas of the building. As I made my way back down the stairwell, I realized that whatever had happened to her was spreading throughout the hospital. I needed to get to the pharmacy while I still could. My 15 years of experience had taught me that in any medical emergency, having the right medications could mean the difference between life and death. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew that anesthetics, antibiotics, and pain medications might be crucial for whatever came next. The backup power failure had left the pharmacy's electronic locks in manual mode, which meant I could access areas that would normally require administrative authorization. As I moved through the darkened hallways, using my phone's flashlight to navigate, I started to see more evidence of what was happening. Overturned gurneys, blood on the walls, and abandoned medical equipment scattered across the floors. But the most disturbing thing was the silence from the patient rooms. In 15 years of working night shifts, I'd never heard a hospital this quiet. Even during the calmest nights, there were always sounds of people breathing, talking, or calling for help. I made it to the pharmacy and started gathering everything I thought might be useful. Morphine, propofol, midazolam, antibiotics, steroids, anything that might help treat infection or manage pain. I filled 2 large medical bags with supplies, along with syringes, IV equipment, and basic surgical instruments. I was operating on pure instinct, grabbing things that had proven useful in trauma situations, but I had no idea if any of it would be effective against whatever was happening to people. While I was in the pharmacy, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, unsteady footsteps that didn't sound like normal walking. I turned off my phone's flashlight and listened, hoping it was another survivor, but knowing in my gut that it wasn't. The footsteps stopped right outside the pharmacy door, and I could hear breathing that sounded labored and wrong somehow. I waited in complete darkness for what felt like an eternity, listening to whatever was outside the door. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, but I knew I couldn't stay in the hospital much longer. Whatever was happening was spreading, and the building was becoming more dangerous by the hour. I finished gathering supplies and started making my way toward the emergency exit, knowing that once I left the hospital, I'd be on my own in a city that was falling apart. The emergency exit led to a loading dock area behind the hospital. As I stepped outside, the heat hit me immediately. Even at 2 in the morning, the temperature was still over 80 degrees, and the air felt thick and oppressive. I could hear more sirens in the distance, but they sounded farther away than before, like the emergency services were retreating from certain areas of the city. I had 2 medical bags full of supplies, no vehicle, and no clear plan for getting across Chicago to find my daughters. But I had something that most people didn't have in this situation. I had medical knowledge that might be crucial for survival, and I had 15 years of experience making life-and-death decisions under pressure. I didn't know it yet, but those skills were going to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. As I started walking away from the hospital, heading toward the main street, I realized that the rolling blackouts had left most of the streetlights dead. The only illumination came from fires burning in the distance and the occasional emergency vehicle. I was walking into a city that was transforming into something completely different from the Chicago I'd known my entire life, and I had no idea what I was going to find when I tried to reach my family. The first 3 blocks were eerily quiet, but as I got closer to the main thoroughfares, I started hearing sounds that confirmed my worst fears. Screaming, breaking glass, and those same inhuman vocalizations I'd heard from Mrs. Chen. Whatever was in the water supply had affected more people than just the patients we'd seen at the hospital, and it was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. I kept walking, staying in the shadows, carrying medical supplies that might be the key to survival toward daughters who might already be dead. But I was still alive, I still had my medical knowledge, and I wasn't going to give up on finding them. The next 15 hours were going to test everything I thought I knew about medicine, survival, and what it means to be human. The walk through those first 3 blocks taught me that everything I thought I knew about my city was wrong. Chicago had become a maze of dangers that I couldn't predict or prepare for, and every decision I made could be my last. I kept thinking about Emma and Sophie, wondering if they were safe, if they were still alive, if they were waiting for me to find them. Those thoughts kept me moving forward when every rational part of my brain was telling me to find somewhere safe and wait for help that might never come. By the time I reached Michigan Avenue, I realized that help wasn't coming. The emergency services were overwhelmed, and from what I could see, they were retreating from large sections of the city rather than trying to maintain control. I passed 3 abandoned police cars and 2 fire trucks that had been left in the middle of the street with their doors open and emergency lights still flashing. Whatever the officers and firefighters had encountered, it had been serious enough to make them abandon their vehicles and flee on foot. I made the decision to go back to the hospital, not because it was safe, but because I needed to find other survivors and figure out what we were really dealing with. Walking alone through the city with 2 bags of medical supplies was going to get me killed, and I knew that my best chance of reaching my daughters was to find people I could work with. The hospital might be dangerous, but it was familiar territory, and I knew every corridor and stairwell in that building. Getting back inside was easier than I expected, which should have been my first warning that things had gotten much worse in the few hours I'd been gone. The security doors that should have been locked were standing open, and there were no guards at any of the checkpoints. I made my way back to the stairwell, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate where the infected patients were located. I found my first survivor on the 4th floor. Nurse Martinez had barricaded herself in one of the family consultation rooms, the kind of private space we used to deliver bad news to relatives. She'd moved a desk against the door and was sitting in the corner with a baseball bat that she'd gotten from somewhere. When I knocked and identified myself, she was so relieved to hear another human voice that she started crying. Maria Martinez had been working at Metropolitan General for 8 years, mostly in the intensive care unit. She was one of those nurses who could handle anything, the kind of person you wanted on your team during a code blue situation. But when she let me into that room, I could see that she was barely holding herself together. She told me that she'd watched 3 of her colleagues transform over the past few hours, and she'd been trapped in that room since around 4 in the morning. The story she told me filled in some of the gaps about what had happened after I'd fled to the roof. The infection had spread through the hospital faster than anyone could have predicted. Patients who had seemed stable suddenly became violent and unpredictable. Staff members who had been drinking the tap water started showing symptoms, and within hours they were attacking other people. Maria had seen Dr. Peterson from Cardiology Corner, one of the orderlies in the break room, and she'd watched him tear the man apart with his bare hands. While we were talking, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, shuffling footsteps that would stop periodically, like someone was listening or searching for something. Maria gripped her baseball bat tighter, and I realized that we couldn't stay in that room much longer. We needed to find a more defensible location, and we needed to find other survivors who could help us figure out how to get out of the hospital alive. I suggested we try to reach the pharmacy, since I knew the layout and we could barricade ourselves in there with access to medical supplies. Maria agreed, but she made me promise that if she started showing symptoms, I would do whatever was necessary to stop her from hurting other people. She told me that she'd been drinking tap water just like everyone else, and she was terrified that she might be infected without knowing it yet. We made our way through the hospital corridors, staying close to the walls and moving as quietly as possible. The emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow that made the familiar hallways look like something from a nightmare. We passed several rooms where we could hear movement, but we didn't investigate. Our goal was to reach the pharmacy and establish a safe base where we could plan our next moves. We found 2 more survivors in the pharmacy. Security guard Thompson had the same idea I'd had about securing the medication storage area, and he'd brought Dr. Williams from pediatrics with him. Thompson was a former military police officer who'd been working hospital security for 6 years, and Dr. Williams was someone I'd worked with on several pediatric surgeries. Having a team of 4 people with different skills gave me hope that we might be able to survive long enough to figure out what was really happening. Dr. Williams had been observing the infection's progression in the children's ward before she'd been forced to evacuate. She told us something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. The children who had been infected were showing symptoms faster than the adults, but they were also recovering differently. Some of the kids who had received IV fluids instead of drinking tap water were showing slower progression of symptoms. This suggested that the concentration of whatever was in the water supply might affect how quickly people transformed. Thompson had been monitoring the hospital's security cameras until the power situation forced him to abandon the security office. He'd watched the infection spread through different sections of the building, and he'd noticed patterns in how the infected people behaved. They seemed to be attracted to noise and movement, but they also appeared to be searching for something specific. They weren't just randomly violent. They were hunting. We spent several hours in the pharmacy, taking inventory of the medical supplies and trying to understand what we were dealing with. I had brought my 2 bags of medications from my earlier trip, and Thompson had gathered additional supplies from other areas of the hospital. We had enough antibiotics, pain medications, and anesthetics to last several days, but we had no idea if any of these medications would be effective against the infection. Dr. Williams made an observation that would prove crucial later. She noticed that some of the infected patients had different levels of coordination and awareness. The ones who had been infected for longer periods seemed more focused and deliberate in their actions, while the newly infected were more chaotic and unpredictable. This suggested that the infection might progress in stages, with different symptoms and capabilities at each stage. Maria had been keeping track of time, and she informed us that it had been almost 16 hours since the first reports of unusual patient behavior. The hospital had been completely overrun in less than a day, which meant that whatever was happening was spreading much faster than any disease outbreak in recorded history. If the same thing was happening across the city, then Chicago was essentially lost. We tried to contact the outside world using the hospital's landline system, but we couldn't get through to anyone. The emergency broadcast was still repeating the same messages about avoiding tap water and staying indoors, but there were no updates about rescue operations or safe zones. We were on our own, and we needed to make decisions about whether to stay in the hospital or try to evacuate to somewhere safer. Thompson suggested that we try to reach one of the emergency shelters that the city had set up for situations like natural disasters. There was a community center about 6 blocks away that was supposed to be a designated emergency gathering point, and it might have resources and other survivors that we could work with. But getting there would mean leaving the familiar territory of the hospital and venturing into streets that were completely unpredictable. I told the group about my daughters and my need to get across the city to find them. Emma and Sophie were my priority, and while I wanted to help the group survive, I couldn't abandon them to stay safe in the hospital. Dr. Williams understood, since she had family somewhere in the city as well, but Maria and Thompson were more hesitant about leaving a secure location for something unknown. We were debating our options when we heard something that made the decision for us. The infected had found the stairwell that led to our floor, and we could hear multiple sets of footsteps coming up toward the pharmacy. The sounds they were making were different from what I'd heard from Mrs. Chen. These were more coordinated, more purposeful, like they were communicating with each other in some way. Thompson had been monitoring the corridor through the small window in the pharmacy door, and he reported that there were at least 5 infected people moving through the hallway. They weren't stumbling around randomly like I'd expected. They were searching room by room, systematically checking each door and window. This level of organization was terrifying because it suggested that whatever was controlling them was intelligent. We had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the pharmacy, and we needed to make a decision about whether to fight or flee. Thompson had a security baton and his military training. Maria had her baseball bat. Dr. Williams had a scalpel, and I had my medical knowledge and a bag full of medications that might or might not be useful as weapons. We were not equipped for a direct confrontation with 5 infected people who seemed to be coordinating their search. The pharmacy had a service entrance that led to a loading area behind the building. It wasn't an ideal escape route because we didn't know what was waiting outside, but it was better than trying to fight our way through infected people in a confined space. We gathered our medical supplies and prepared to evacuate, knowing that once we left the hospital, we'd be committed to finding shelter somewhere else in the city. Before we left, I made a decision that would prove important later. I grabbed several vials of propofol and midazolam, along with a handful of syringes. My experience with Mrs. Chen had shown me that the infected retained some human physiological responses, and I thought that anesthetics might be useful if we encountered infected people and needed to incapacitate them temporarily. I had no idea if it would work, but it was the only weapon I had that made sense based on my medical training. We slipped out through the service entrance while the infected were still searching the upper floors. The loading area was clear, but we could see evidence of violence in the surrounding area. Overturned vehicles, broken windows, and dark stains on the pavement that I tried not to think about too carefully. The city was transforming into something unrecognizable, and we were 4 people with medical supplies trying to navigate through chaos that was getting worse by the hour. Thompson took point as we moved away from the hospital, using his military experience to guide us through the streets safely. Our destination was the community center 6 blocks away, but we had to move carefully and avoid attracting attention from whatever infected people might be in the area. The heat was still oppressive, even though dawn was approaching, and we were all dealing with dehydration and exhaustion from the stress of the past 18 hours. 3 blocks from the hospital, we encountered our first group of infected people in the open. There were 4 of them standing in the middle of an intersection, and they weren't moving or making noise. They were just standing there, like they were waiting for something. Thompson signaled for us to stop and find an alternate route, but as we were backing away, one of them turned and looked directly at us. The way it looked at us was different from what I'd seen with Mrs. Chen. There was recognition in its eyes, like it understood that we were prey and it was predator. It made a sound that wasn't quite human, and the other 3 immediately turned toward us as well. They didn't run at us or stumble in our direction. They began walking toward us with purpose and coordination that was absolutely terrifying. We ran. There was no medical protocol for dealing with infected people who could organize and hunt, so we fell back on basic survival instinct and tried to put distance between us and them. Thompson led us through an alley between 2 buildings, but we could hear footsteps behind us that suggested we were being followed. Whatever these things were, they were persistent, and they weren't giving up the chase easily. We made it to the community center, but it wasn't the safe haven we'd hoped for. The building was dark, the doors were standing open, and there were clear signs that something violent had happened there recently. Thompson checked the perimeter while the rest of us waited, and when he came back, his expression told us everything we needed to know. The community center had been overrun just like the hospital, but we found something there that changed everything. In one of the back rooms, we discovered a survivor who had been hiding since the previous evening. His name was David Chen, and he worked for the Chicago Department of Water Management. He'd been at the water treatment plant when the contamination was first detected, and he had information about what had actually been released into the water supply. David told us that the contamination wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately introduced something into the water system, something that the standard filtration and purification processes couldn't remove. He tried to report it to his supervisors, but the communication systems had failed before he could get through to anyone with authority to shut down the water distribution. By the time they realized what was happening, millions of people had already been exposed. The information David provided explained why the infection was spreading so quickly and why it seemed to affect different people at different rates. The concentration of the contaminant varied depending on water pressure and distribution patterns throughout the city. Areas with higher water pressure and more recent water main installations had received higher concentrations, which explained why some neighborhoods were hit harder than others. More importantly, David told us that there were areas of the city that were still receiving clean water from emergency reserves. The water department had protocols for switching to backup supplies in case of contamination, and some districts had been cut off from the main distribution system before they could be fully exposed. If we could reach one of these areas, we might find survivors who weren't infected and resources that could help us survive. Maria had been feeling sick since we'd left the hospital, and she finally admitted that she'd been drinking tap water regularly over the past few days. She was showing early symptoms of the infection, including nausea, fever, and the same agitation that we'd seen in the hospital patients. She begged us not to abandon her, but she also made us promise that we wouldn't let her hurt anyone if she transformed. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had vials of propofol in my medical bag, and I knew that anesthetics could potentially slow down the infection's progression based on what I'd observed with the dilated pupils and reduced pain response in infected patients. I didn't know if it would save Maria, but I thought it might buy us time to find help or figure out a treatment. I administered a carefully measured dose of propofol to Maria, monitoring her vital signs and watching for any changes in her symptoms. The results were remarkable and terrifying at the same time. Her fever decreased, her agitation calmed, and the progression of symptoms seemed to slow significantly. But the effect was temporary, and I realized that I might have discovered something important about treating the infection, even if I couldn't cure it. Dr. Williams was fascinated by what she'd observed with Maria's response to the anesthetic. She theorized that the infection might be affecting the nervous system in a way that made anesthetics more effective at controlling symptoms than traditional medications. If we could find a way to maintain steady levels of anesthetics in infected people, we might be able to keep them functional long enough to find a real cure. Thompson was more practical about our situation. We had limited medical supplies. We were in a city that was falling apart, and we had no clear plan for finding safety. Maria's temporary improvement was encouraging, but it didn't solve our fundamental problem of survival. We needed to find a secure location where we could establish a base of operations and figure out our next moves. David suggested that we try to reach one of the water treatment facilities on the outskirts of the city. These locations would have backup power, communication equipment, and access to clean water supplies. More importantly, they would have detailed information about which areas of the city were still receiving uncontaminated water and where we might find other survivors. The problem was that the water treatment plant was 15 miles from our current location, and we had no vehicle and no clear route through a city that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. We would have to travel on foot through neighborhoods that we knew nothing about, carrying medical supplies that were essential for our survival, but would slow us down significantly. I was torn between staying with the group and trying to find a way to reach my daughters. Emma and Sophie were somewhere across the city, and every hour that passed made it less likely that they were still alive and safe. But Maria needed medical attention that only I could provide, and the group needed my knowledge of medications and medical procedures to have any chance of survival. We decided to stay at the community center for the rest of the night and make our decision about the water treatment plant in the morning. Thompson and David worked on securing the building while Dr. Williams and I took care of Maria and tried to understand more about the infection and potential treatments. We were 5 people with different skills and priorities, trying to survive in a situation that none of us had ever imagined possible. As dawn approached, we could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the city. Chicago was burning, and we were running out of time to find safety. The infection was spreading faster than any response efforts could contain it, and we were on our own in a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. Maria was stable for now, but I knew the anesthetic effects were temporary, and we would need to make decisions about treatment that could determine whether she lived or died. I kept thinking about Emma and Sophie, wondering if they were safe, if they were waiting for me, if they even knew that I was trying to reach them. The guilt of not being with them when the world ended was overwhelming, but I also knew that abandoning Maria and the group might mean that none of us would survive long enough to reunite with our families. The next few hours would determine whether we could find a way to stay alive in a city that was no longer safe for human beings. Dawn brought new horrors that made the previous night seem like a peaceful dream. From the windows of the community center, we could see that entire city blocks were now burning uncontrolled. The smoke was so thick that it blocked out the morning sun, casting everything in an orange haze that made breathing difficult. What terrified me most was the silence. Chicago should have been filled with sirens, helicopters, emergency responses of every kind. Instead, there was just the distant crackling of fires and sounds that I was learning to recognize as the infected moving through the streets. Maria had stabilized overnight, but I could see that the propofol was wearing off. Her fever was starting to return, and she was becoming more restless despite my efforts to keep her comfortable. Dr. Williams and I had been taking turns monitoring her vital signs, and we both knew that my improvised treatment was only buying us time, not providing a cure. I had enough anesthetic medications to keep her stable for maybe another 12 hours, but after that, we'd be forced to watch her transform into something that would try to kill us. Thompson had spent the early morning hours scouting the surrounding area, and what he reported back made our situation even more desperate. The infected weren't just wandering around randomly anymore. They were organizing into groups, and they seemed to be establishing territories or hunting zones. He'd observed a group of 15 infected people moving systematically through a residential neighborhood, checking every house and building in a coordinated search pattern. This level of organization suggested that whatever was controlling them was learning and adapting. David had been working with the community center's emergency radio equipment, trying to establish contact with other survivors or emergency services. Most of the channels were either dead or broadcasting automated emergency messages, but he'd managed to pick up scattered transmissions from people trapped in various locations around the city. The reports were consistently grim. The infection had spread to every major neighborhood, emergency services had collapsed, and there was no coordinated rescue effort underway. But David had also discovered something that gave us a glimmer of hope. He'd made contact with a group of survivors at Northwestern University who claimed to have access to clean water and temporary shelter. They were approximately 8 miles from our current location, which meant we could potentially reach them in a day of careful travel. More importantly, they reported having a doctor with them who was working on understanding the infection and potential treatments. The decision to leave the community center wasn't really a choice. We were running out of medical supplies. Maria needed treatment that I couldn't provide with our current resources, and staying in one location was becoming increasingly dangerous as the infected groups became more organized in their search patterns. We needed to find other survivors who could help us, and we needed to find them soon. I made the difficult decision to tell the group about my daughters and my ultimate goal of reaching them across the city. Emma and Sophie were staying with their mother in Lincoln Park, which was roughly 12 miles northeast of our current position. The Northwestern University group was in the opposite direction from where I needed to go, but I also knew that trying to cross the city alone with limited supplies would likely get me killed before I could reach my family. Dr. Williams surprised me by volunteering to help me reach my daughters after we established contact with the Northwestern group. She understood the impossible choice I was facing between helping our current group survive and finding my own family. Her offer meant that I wouldn't have to abandon Maria and the others, but it also meant putting another person at risk for my personal mission. We spent 2 hours planning our route to Northwestern University, using David's knowledge of the water distribution system to identify areas that might have lower concentrations of infected people. The neighborhoods that had been receiving cleaner water were more likely to have survivors, but they were also more likely to have organized groups of people who might not welcome strangers. We had to balance the risk of encountering hostile survivors against the certainty of facing infected people in the heavily contaminated areas. Thompson took charge of our security planning, assigning each person specific responsibilities for watch duties, supply management, and emergency protocols. His military experience was invaluable for organizing our group into an effective unit, but I could see the strain in his eyes. He was carrying the weight of keeping all of us alive, and he knew that one mistake could get everyone killed. We left the community center at noon, moving in a tight formation with Thompson leading and me bringing up the rear with the medical supplies. Maria was walking between Dr. Williams and David, and I was monitoring her condition constantly for any signs that the infection was progressing faster than expected. I had prepared 2 more doses of propofol that I could administer if necessary, but I was hoping we could reach the Northwestern group before I had to use them. The first 3 blocks of our journey showed us how much the city had changed overnight. Abandoned vehicles were scattered across the streets, many of them crashed or overturned. Store windows were broken, and there were signs of looting and violence everywhere we looked. But what disturbed me most was the absence of bodies. With this level of destruction, there should have been casualties visible. But instead, there were just dark stains on the pavement and trails of blood leading into buildings or alleyways. Thompson stopped our group when we reached a major intersection and signaled for complete silence. He'd spotted movement in one of the office buildings across the street, and he was trying to determine whether we were looking at survivors or infected people. After several minutes of observation, he identified at least 6 figures moving systematically through the building, floor by floor, room by room. Their coordinated search pattern confirmed that these were infected people, and they were getting more sophisticated in their hunting behavior. We took a detour through a residential neighborhood to avoid the organized infected group, but this decision led us into a different kind of danger. The houses in this area showed signs of violent struggles, with doors broken down and windows smashed from the inside. David explained that this neighborhood had been one of the first areas to receive the contaminated water, which meant the residents had been dealing with the infection for over 48 hours. As we moved through the residential streets, I started noticing patterns in the destruction that made my medical training react with alarm. The damage to these houses wasn't random violence or panic-driven destruction. Someone or something had been systematically searching these homes, looking for specific things or people. Doors had been forced open with precision, and the paths of destruction through each house followed logical search patterns. Maria started showing increased symptoms as we reached the halfway point of our journey. Her temperature was rising again, and she was becoming more agitated despite my efforts to keep her calm. I administered another dose of propofol, but I could see that each treatment was becoming less effective. The infection was adapting to the medication, or her body was building resistance to the anesthetic effects. Either way, I was running out of options for keeping her stable. Dr. Williams pulled me aside to discuss Maria's condition and our limited treatment options. She'd been observing the progression of symptoms, and she believed that we were seeing evidence of different stages of infection. The initial phase involved fever, nausea, and agitation, which responded to anesthetic treatment. But there seemed to be a second phase where the infected people became more coordinated and focused, and we had no idea what medications might be effective during that stage. We found temporary shelter in an abandoned elementary school, while I worked on treating Maria, and the group rested from the physical strain of navigating through the destroyed city. The school had been evacuated, but there were signs that people had been using it as a shelter recently. Fresh supplies, makeshift bedding, and a communication setup that suggested other survivors had been trying to coordinate rescue efforts from this location. Thompson discovered evidence that the school had been attacked by infected people within the past 12 hours. Broken windows, overturned furniture, and those same dark stains that we'd been seeing throughout our journey. But there were also signs that the survivors had fought back effectively and managed to escape rather than being overwhelmed. This gave us hope that resistance was possible, even against the organized infected groups. David managed to establish radio contact with the Northwestern University group while we were sheltering in the school. The news they provided was both encouraging and terrifying. They confirmed that they had access to clean water, medical supplies, and temporary shelter for additional survivors. But they also reported that the infected groups in their area were becoming increasingly aggressive and coordinated, suggesting that the infection was continuing to evolve. More disturbing was their report that some infected people were demonstrating problem-solving abilities and tool use. They'd observed infected individuals using makeshift weapons and working together to overcome barriers that would have stopped them in the early stages of the infection. This suggested that whatever was causing the transformation wasn't just destroying human intelligence, but redirecting it toward hunting and survival purposes. The Northwestern group also provided information about the broader situation in Chicago and the surrounding areas. Military forces had established quarantine zones around the city, but they were focusing on containment rather than rescue operations. Anyone inside the quarantine zone was considered potentially infected and would not be allowed to evacuate. We were trapped in the city with millions of other people, and there was no external help coming. I realized that reaching my daughters had become even more critical than I'd originally thought. If Emma and Sophie were still alive, they were trapped in the same quarantine zone, and our only hope for survival was to find each other and work together. The fantasy of government rescue or medical intervention was gone, and we were reduced to basic survival in a city that was becoming more dangerous every hour. Maria's condition deteriorated rapidly while we were at the school. The propofol was no longer effective at controlling her symptoms, and she was entering what appeared to be the second stage of infection. Her fever spiked to dangerous levels. Her coordination improved dramatically, and she started showing signs of the focused hunting behavior that we'd observed in other infected people. Dr. Williams and I had to make the decision that we'd all been dreading. I prepared a lethal dose of morphine while Dr. Williams held Maria's hand and tried to keep her calm. This was the hardest medical decision I'd ever had to make, but I knew that allowing her to complete the transformation would put everyone else in the group at risk. Maria understood what was happening, and in her final moments of lucidity, she thanked us for trying to save her and asked us to find her family if we survived. The loss of Maria changed the dynamic of our group in ways that I hadn't anticipated. We'd lost our most experienced nurse, but more importantly, we'd lost our hope that the infection could be treated with the resources we had available. My experiments with anesthetics had bought us time, but they hadn't provided a cure, and we now knew that anyone who became infected would eventually become a threat to the rest of the group. Thompson became more focused on security protocols after Maria's death, insisting on stricter watch schedules and contingency plans for group members who might become infected. David withdrew into himself, spending most of his time monitoring radio communications and trying to find information about his own family's status. Dr. Williams threw herself into analyzing what we'd learned about the infection, hoping to find patterns that might help us understand how to avoid or survive exposure. We left the elementary school in the late afternoon, continuing our journey toward Northwestern University with 3 people instead of 4. The weight of Maria's death was affecting all of us, but we couldn't afford to stop and grieve properly. The infected groups were becoming more active as the day progressed, and we needed to reach the Northwestern survivors before darkness made travel even more dangerous. The final 3 miles of our journey took us through the campus area of Northwestern University, and what we found there challenged everything we thought we knew about the infected people. The university had been transformed into a fortress, with barricades, defensive positions, and clear evidence of organized resistance against the infected groups. But we also saw signs that the infected were adapting their tactics in response to these defenses. We observed an infected group conducting what could only be described as reconnaissance of the university's defensive perimeter. They weren't just attacking randomly or following basic instincts. They were studying the barriers, testing weak points, and communicating with each other using sounds and gestures that suggested a level of coordination that was absolutely terrifying. The Northwestern survivors had established their base in the university's medical research building, which had backup power, laboratory facilities, and access to medical supplies that were far beyond what we'd been able to gather. When we finally made contact with them, we discovered that they'd been working on understanding the infection since the first day of the outbreak, and they had information that changed everything we thought we knew about what we were fighting. Dr. Sarah Chen, who was leading the medical research efforts, explained that the infection wasn't just a biological contamination of the water supply. It was something that had been deliberately engineered to alter human brain chemistry in specific ways. The infected people weren't losing their intelligence. They were having their cognitive priorities restructured to focus entirely on hunting and survival. This explained why they were becoming more coordinated and effective over time. The Northwestern group had also discovered that the infection progressed differently depending on individual factors like age, health status, and previous exposure to certain medications. Children seemed to be more resistant to the transformation, while adults with certain medical conditions progressed faster. Most importantly, they'd identified several medications that could slow or prevent the infection if administered before full transformation occurred. But the information that affected me most directly was their report about the Lincoln Park area where my daughters were staying. The neighborhood had been heavily affected by the contamination, and the infected population there was among the most organized and aggressive in the city. The Northwestern group had lost contact with survivors in that area over 12 hours ago, and they believed that any remaining uninfected people were either dead or trapped in heavily fortified locations. Dr. Williams volunteered to stay with the Northwestern group to help with their research efforts, but she also prepared supplies and information that would help me reach Lincoln Park and find my daughters. She believed that my medical knowledge and experience with treating infected people would be crucial for any rescue attempt, and she wanted to make sure I had the best possible chance of success. Thompson made the decision to accompany me to Lincoln Park, despite the risks involved. His military experience and tactical knowledge would be invaluable for navigating through territory controlled by organized infected groups, and he understood that attempting the journey alone would likely be suicide. David chose to stay with the Northwestern group, where his knowledge of the city's infrastructure could help with their survival and research efforts. We spent our last night with the Northwestern group preparing for what we all knew would be the most dangerous part of my journey. I studied maps of the Lincoln Park area, memorized the locations of potential shelter and escape routes, and prepared medical supplies that might be crucial for treating Emma and Sophie if I found them alive but injured or infected. The Northwestern group had developed protocols for moving through infected territory that were based on careful observation of hunting patterns and behavior triggers. They'd learned that infected people were attracted to certain sounds and movements, but they could be avoided or misdirected using techniques that took advantage of their altered cognitive priorities. This information might be the difference between reaching my daughters and becoming another casualty of the outbreak. As I prepared to leave the relative safety of the Northwestern University base, I realized that everything had changed since I'd started this journey at the hospital 2 days ago. I was no longer just a doctor trying to help patients survive a medical emergency. I was a father searching for his children in a city where humanity itself was being transformed into something alien and dangerous. The next 12 hours would determine whether I could find Emma and Sophie before the infected groups that controlled their neighborhood found me. Thompson and I left Northwestern University at dawn on the third day, carrying everything we'd learned about navigating infected territory and enough medical supplies to treat serious injuries or early-stage infections. The 12-mile journey to Lincoln Park should have taken us 4 hours of careful travel, but we both knew that we were moving through the most dangerous part of Chicago. The infected groups in that area had been organizing longer than anywhere else in the city, and they'd had more time to establish hunting patterns and territorial control. Dr. Williams had given me detailed information about the medications that might be effective against early-stage infection, along with precise dosing instructions and administration techniques. She'd also prepared a field surgery kit that would allow me to perform emergency procedures if I found Emma and Sophie injured but alive. The weight of these supplies was significant, but I knew that arriving without the ability to treat my daughters would make finding them meaningless. The Northwestern group had provided us with maps that showed the safest routes through infected territory, based on their observations of hunting patterns and territorial boundaries. These weren't normal city maps, but tactical guides that identified which streets were controlled by infected groups, which buildings provided good shelter or observation points, and which areas should be avoided entirely. The level of detail was both impressive and terrifying because it demonstrated how completely the infected had taken control of large sections of the city. Our first challenge came within 2 miles of leaving Northwestern University. We encountered what Thompson identified as a patrol, a group of 6 infected people moving in a coordinated formation through a commercial district. They weren't searching randomly or following basic instincts. They were systematically checking each building, communicating with each other using subtle sounds and gestures, and maintaining formation discipline that reminded Thompson of military reconnaissance units. We observed this patrol from a concealed position for over an hour, studying their behavior patterns and trying to understand how they organized their search operations. What we discovered was both fascinating and horrifying from a medical perspective. The infected people were demonstrating cognitive abilities that were focused entirely on hunting and territorial control, but they were also showing signs of individual specialization within their group structure. One infected person seemed to be focused on tracking, constantly checking the ground and air for scents or signs of prey. Another was clearly serving as a lookout, maintaining elevated positions and scanning for movement or threats. A third appeared to be the coordinator, making decisions about search patterns and group movement. This level of role specialization suggested that the infection wasn't just preserving intelligence, but redirecting it toward highly efficient predatory behavior. Thompson used his military experience to help us avoid the patrol by timing our movement with their search patterns and using cover that would mask our scent and sound. But the process was exhausting and time-consuming, and we realized that every infected group we encountered would require the same level of caution and tactical planning. At this rate, reaching Lincoln Park would take much longer than we'd anticipated. The neighborhoods we traveled through told the story of how quickly Chicago had fallen to the infection. Houses that had been family homes 3 days ago were now showing signs of having been systematically searched and claimed by infected groups. Windows were broken in specific patterns that suggested coordinated entry rather than random violence. Personal belongings were scattered in ways that indicated the infected were looking for specific things, possibly food, water, or survivors. What disturbed me most was the evidence of resistance that had been overcome. We found barricades that had been constructed by survivors, but had been systematically dismantled by infected groups working together. Defense positions that should have been effective against random attacks had been neutralized by coordinated assaults that demonstrated tactical thinking and problem-solving abilities. The infected weren't just mindless predators, they were adaptive hunters who learned from each encounter. Thompson pointed out defensive positions that survivors had tried to establish, and he explained how the infected groups had overcome them. Barriers had been flanked rather than attacked directly. Elevated positions had been surrounded and cut off from escape routes. Defensive tactics that would have been effective against human attackers had been neutralized by infected groups that didn't respond to psychological warfare or intimidation. We found our first evidence of recent survivor activity at a water treatment facility that David had identified as one of the locations still receiving clean water from emergency reserves. The building showed signs of having been occupied by uninfected people within the past 24 hours, but it had been abandoned hastily, with supplies and equipment left behind in ways that suggested the survivors had been forced to flee quickly. Thompson found evidence that the facility had been attacked by an infected group within the past 12 hours. The defensive positions that the survivors had established were sophisticated and well-planned, but they'd been overcome by what appeared to be a coordinated assault involving multiple infected groups working together. This level of cooperation between different infected populations was something that none of the survivor groups had reported previously. Inside the water treatment facility, we discovered technical documentation that explained why some areas of the city were more heavily infected than others. The contamination had been introduced at specific points in the water distribution system, creating concentration gradients that affected different neighborhoods differently. The infected groups seemed to be establishing territories based on these contamination patterns, with the most heavily affected areas becoming strongholds for the largest and most organized infected populations. This information helped explain why Lincoln Park was considered one of the most dangerous areas in the city. The neighborhood had received some of the highest concentrations of contaminated water, which meant that the infection rate was nearly complete, and the infected population had been organizing for longer than in other areas. Finding uninfected survivors in that territory would be extremely difficult, but it also meant that if Emma and Sophie were still alive, they would need immediate rescue before the infected groups found them. We spent several hours at the water treatment facility, studying the technical documentation and planning our approach to Lincoln Park. The maps and distribution data provided by David showed us exactly which buildings in my ex-wife's neighborhood would have received the highest concentrations of contaminated water, and therefore which areas would be most heavily controlled by infected groups. Thompson identified several potential observation points that would allow us to scout the Lincoln Park area before committing to a rescue attempt. These were elevated positions that provided good visibility of the neighborhood where Emma and Sophie were staying, but were far enough away to avoid immediate detection by infected patrols. We would need to spend time observing the area to understand the infected group's territory boundaries and patrol patterns before attempting to reach my daughters. The journey from the water treatment facility to our observation points took us through some of the most devastated areas we'd encountered. Entire city blocks had been systematically cleared of uninfected people, with buildings showing signs of having been searched floor by floor, room by room. The infected groups weren't just hunting randomly. They were conducting comprehensive sweeps that eliminated any possibility of survivors hiding in their territory. We encountered evidence of large-scale coordinated operations that challenged everything we thought we knew about the infected people's capabilities. Thompson found tactical positions that suggested infected groups had conducted complex multi-phase assaults on survivor strongholds. Barricades had been bypassed using flanking maneuvers that required advanced planning and coordination between multiple units. Most disturbing was the evidence that infected groups were using tools and equipment in sophisticated ways. We found locations where they'd used vehicles to break through barriers, construction equipment to overcome elevated defensive positions, and what appeared to be communication devices to coordinate attacks across multiple locations simultaneously. The infected weren't just retaining human intelligence, they were applying it more effectively than many human military units. Thompson began showing signs of stress and fatigue as we approached the Lincoln Park area. His military training had prepared him for human conflicts, but the infected groups were using tactics that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts that made them unpredictable and extremely dangerous. He admitted that fighting against enemies who didn't respond to psychological warfare or conventional intimidation was unlike anything he'd experienced. We reached our primary observation point in the early afternoon, establishing a concealed position in an abandoned office building that provided clear views of the neighborhood where my ex-wife lived. What we saw through binoculars confirmed our worst fears about the level of infected organization in the area. The neighborhood was completely controlled by infected groups, with clear evidence of territorial boundaries, patrol routes, and defensive positions. Thompson counted at least 40 infected people visible in the immediate area, organized into what appeared to be specialized units with different responsibilities. Some were clearly scouts, moving constantly through the neighborhood and checking for signs of intrusion. Others were stationed at strategic positions that would allow them to respond quickly to any threats or opportunities. Still others appeared to be engaged in activities that we couldn't identify from our observation point. The house where Emma and Sophie had been staying was located in the center of the most heavily patrolled area, surrounded by infected groups that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. But I could see signs that someone had been making modifications to the house recently, reinforcing windows and doors in ways that suggested survivors were still inside and actively defending their position. Thompson used his military experience to analyze the infected group's tactical positions and identify potential weaknesses in their coverage. He found several possible approach routes that might allow us to reach the house without being detected, but all of them required precise timing and the ability to move silently through territory where any mistake would result in immediate detection and pursuit by multiple infected groups. While we were observing the neighborhood, Thompson noticed something that changed our understanding of the infected group's capabilities. They were rotating their patrol schedules and defensive positions on a regular basis, preventing anyone from predicting their movements or identifying permanent weak points in their coverage. This level of tactical sophistication suggested that they were learning and adapting their security protocols in response to potential threats. More troubling was Thompson's observation that the infected group seemed to be aware that they were being observed. Several times, infected individuals looked directly toward our observation point, even though we were concealed and hadn't made any noise or movement that should have attracted their attention. They appeared to have developed enhanced sensory capabilities that allowed them to detect threats from much greater distances than normal humans. As afternoon turned to evening, we realized that approaching the house during daylight would be impossible without being detected. The infected groups maintained too much coverage of the area, and their enhanced awareness made concealment extremely difficult. We would have to wait for darkness, but we also knew that the infected might be even more dangerous at night when their enhanced senses would give them additional advantages. Thompson developed a tactical plan that involved creating diversions to draw infected patrols away from the house, while I attempted to make contact with any survivors inside. The plan was extremely risky because it required splitting our limited resources and depended on precise timing that would be difficult to coordinate without communication equipment. But it was the only approach that offered any realistic chance of success. While we were finalizing our rescue plan, Thompson made an observation that forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about our situation. He'd been monitoring the infected group's movements throughout the afternoon, and he realized that they weren't just patrolling randomly or following basic territorial instincts. They were conducting what appeared to be a systematic search operation, focusing specifically on the house where my daughters were staying. The implications of this discovery were terrifying. Either the infected groups had somehow identified the house as containing survivors and were planning an assault, or they had information about Emma and Sophie that we didn't understand. Thompson believed that we had very little time before the infected groups would overcome whatever defenses the house had and eliminate any survivors inside. I made the decision that would define the next phase of our mission. Instead of waiting for optimal conditions or perfect tactical planning, we would attempt the rescue immediately, using whatever advantages we currently had before the infected groups could complete their systematic search. Thompson protested that this was extremely risky and reduced our chances of survival, but I couldn't watch my daughter's location being systematically surrounded without taking action. Thompson revealed something that he'd been keeping from me about his own condition. He'd been bitten during our escape from the community center, but he'd been hiding the wound and managing the early symptoms with medications from our medical supplies. He was showing signs of early-stage infection, and he knew that he would begin transforming within the next 12 to 18 hours. This confession changed our tactical situation completely. Thompson could participate in the rescue attempt, but he would become a threat to me and my daughters before we could safely evacuate the area. He proposed using his remaining time and deteriorating condition as an advantage, volunteering to create maximum disruption among the infected groups while I attempted to reach Emma and Sophie. The ethical implications of Thompson's proposal were staggering. He was asking me to use his infection and eventual transformation as a tactical weapon, knowing that it would result in his death and possibly make him a danger to other survivors. But he also pointed out that his sacrifice might be the only way to save my daughters, and that trying to treat his infection would consume resources and time that we couldn't afford. I prepared the medical supplies that I would need for treating Emma and Sophie if I found them injured or infected. Based on what I'd learned from treating Maria and the information provided by Dr. Williams, I had medications that could slow early-stage infection and equipment for performing emergency medical procedures. But I also knew that my daughter's survival would depend on reaching them before the infected groups completed their systematic search. Thompson and I spent our final hours together planning the details of our rescue attempt and coordinating our timing. He would begin his diversionary operation at exactly midnight, drawing as many infected groups as possible away from the house, while I approached from the opposite direction and attempted to make contact with any survivors inside. We both understood that this was likely a suicide mission, but it was the only chance we had to save Emma and Sophie. As darkness fell over Lincoln Park, I prepared to discover whether my daughters were still alive and whether I could reach them before the most organized infected groups in Chicago eliminated the last survivors in their territory. Thompson was entering the final hours of his humanity, and I was about to attempt the most dangerous medical rescue of my career in conditions that no medical training could have prepared me for. At exactly midnight, Thompson began his diversionary operation, and I started what I knew would be the most important journey of my life. The sounds of his engagement with the infected groups carried across the neighborhood, drawing their attention away from the house where my daughters were hopefully still alive. I had maybe 30 minutes before the infected would realize they were being misdirected and return to their systematic search patterns. Moving through the infected territory required every piece of medical knowledge I had about human sensory capabilities and cognitive function. The infected had enhanced awareness, but they were also focused on specific stimuli that I could avoid if I understood their altered neurological priorities. I stayed downwind, moved during moments when other sounds would mask my footsteps, and avoided direct lines of sight that would trigger their enhanced visual tracking abilities. The house where Emma and Sophie had been staying looked different from when I'd last visited 6 months ago during a custody exchange. The windows had been reinforced with furniture and boards, the doors had been barricaded from the inside, and there were signs of recent defensive improvements that suggested someone was still alive inside and actively preparing for threats. But I could also see evidence that infected groups had been testing these defenses regularly. I reached the back of the house without being detected, but getting inside would require communication with whoever was inside without alerting the infected groups that were still patrolling the area despite Thompson's diversion. I used a medical emergency code that I'd taught Emma and Sophie years ago, tapping it against the reinforced back door in a pattern they would recognize as coming from me specifically. The response came immediately, confirming that my daughters were alive and aware enough to recognize our emergency communication system. Emma's voice came through the barricaded door, but she sounded different, older somehow, like she'd aged years in the 3 days since the outbreak began. She told me that Sophie was sick but alive, and that they'd been trapped in the house since their mother had transformed on the first day of the outbreak. Getting inside required removing barricades that Emma and Sophie had spent 3 days constructing, but we had to do it quietly enough to avoid attracting attention from infected patrols that might return at any moment. The defensive position they'd created was impressive for two 14-year-old girls working without adult supervision, but it had also become a trap that prevented them from escaping when the neighborhood became too dangerous. When I finally got inside, I found Emma protecting Sophie in an upstairs bedroom that they'd converted into a medical isolation area. Sophie was in the early stages of infection, showing the same symptoms I'd seen in Maria and other patients at the hospital: high fever, agitation, and the beginning stages of the cognitive changes that would eventually transform her into something that would hunt her own sister. Emma had been caring for Sophie, using basic first aid knowledge and supplies they'd found in the house, but she'd also been making impossible decisions about rationing food and water while protecting both of them from their infected mother, who was somewhere else in the house. Emma had barricaded Sophie in the bedroom and had been standing guard for over 60 hours, surviving on almost no sleep and whatever supplies she could find. The medical assessment I performed on Sophie confirmed my worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. She was infected, but she was still in the early stages where treatment might be effective. I had the medications that Dr. Williams had prepared specifically for this situation, and I had the knowledge gained from treating Maria and observing other infected patients. But I also knew that my earlier treatments had only delayed the inevitable, not prevented it. I administered the first dose of the medication cocktail that Dr. Williams had developed, combining anesthetics with other drugs that might slow the infection's progression. Sophie's response was more positive than anything I'd seen previously, with her fever dropping and her agitation decreasing within minutes of treatment. But I also knew that this improvement might be temporary, and I needed to find a way to get both girls out of the infected territory before Sophie's condition deteriorated. Emma told me what had happened during the 3 days since the outbreak began, and her story explained how 2 teenage girls had managed to survive in the most dangerous part of Chicago. Their mother had transformed on the first morning, but Emma had recognized the signs early enough to get Sophie into the upstairs bedroom and barricade the door. She'd been protecting her sister and managing their survival with a level of maturity and decision-making ability that amazed me. But Emma had also been making medical decisions about Sophie's care that demonstrated an understanding of the infection that impressed me as much as it terrified me. She'd realized that certain medications seemed to help Sophie's symptoms, and she'd been rationing water carefully, because she'd observed that dehydration seemed to accelerate the infection's progression. My 14-year-old daughter had been conducting medical experiments that paralleled the research being done by trained physicians. The sound of Thompson's diversion operation was getting closer, which meant that his engagement with the infected groups was either becoming more intense or the infected were beginning to realize that they were being manipulated. We had maybe 15 minutes before infected patrols would return to this area, and we needed to be ready to evacuate immediately when that happened. I prepared additional doses of medication for Sophie and gathered medical supplies that we would need for continuing her treatment during our evacuation. But I also had to explain to Emma that Sophie's condition was extremely serious, and that the medications I was giving her were experimental treatments that might not be effective long-term. Emma understood the implications immediately, and I realized that the outbreak had forced her to mature in ways that no 14-year-old should have to experience. While I was treating Sophie, Emma showed me what she'd discovered about the infected groups that had been surrounding their house. She'd been observing them through the reinforced windows, and she'd identified patterns in their behavior that confirmed what Thompson and I had suspected about their organization and intelligence. The infected weren't just hunting randomly. They were conducting systematic operations with specific objectives. Emma had realized that the infected groups knew she and Sophie were in the house, and they'd been testing the defenses regularly to identify weaknesses without committing to a full assault. She believed they were waiting for something, possibly for Sophie to complete her transformation so they could use her to convince Emma to surrender voluntarily. This level of psychological manipulation suggested that the infected retained far more human intelligence than anyone had realized. The house where we were sheltering also contained evidence of what had happened to their mother after her transformation. Emma had been forced to barricade her infected mother in the basement, where she'd been trapped for 3 days. The sounds from the basement confirmed that she was still alive but fully transformed, and Emma had been living with the knowledge that she might have to kill her own mother to protect herself and Sophie. I made one of the hardest decisions of my life by going to the basement to assess their mother's condition. What I found there challenged everything I thought I understood about the infection and its effects on human consciousness. Their mother was fully transformed, but she showed signs of recognition when she saw me. She was trying to communicate, not through speech, but through gestures and expressions that suggested some level of retained memory and emotional connection. This discovery forced me to reconsider everything I'd assumed about the infected people's mental state. If some level of human consciousness survived the transformation, then the infected weren't just mindless predators. They were people trapped inside bodies that had been reprogrammed for hunting and survival. The ethical implications of this realization would haunt me for the rest of my life, but it also suggested that some infected people might be saved if we could find more effective treatments. Thompson's diversion operation ended abruptly, and the sudden silence told me that either he'd been successful in eliminating the infected groups in his area, or he'd been overwhelmed and killed. Either way, we had very little time before infected patrols would return to our location, and we needed to begin our evacuation immediately. Sophie was stable enough to travel, but she would need continuous medical attention during our journey. I explained to Emma and Sophie that we were going to attempt to reach the Northwestern University safe zone, where there were medical facilities and other survivors who could help with Sophie's treatment. The journey would be extremely dangerous, and Sophie's condition might deteriorate during travel, but staying in the house would mean certain death when the infected groups returned in force. Emma surprised me by suggesting that we try to take their mother with us, arguing that if she retained some level of human consciousness, we might be able to find a way to help her. I had to explain that their mother was fully transformed and would be a danger to all of us. But I also promised Emma that if we found effective treatments for the infection, we would try to help other infected people who might be saved. We prepared for evacuation by gathering essential supplies and medications, but we also had to plan for the possibility that Sophie's condition would worsen during our journey. I prepared emergency medications that could slow rapid progression of symptoms, and I taught Emma basic medical procedures that she could perform if I was injured or killed during our escape attempt. The evacuation from the house required removing the barricades that had kept Emma and Sophie alive for 3 days, but doing it quickly enough to avoid detection by returning infected patrols. We could hear movement in the surrounding area that suggested infected groups were beginning to return to their normal patrol patterns, and we had a very narrow window of opportunity for successful escape. Sophie was able to walk with assistance, but her coordination was affected by both the infection and the medications I'd given her. Emma took responsibility for guiding and supporting her sister while I carried the medical supplies and watched for threats. Our movement was slow and visible, making us vulnerable to detection by any infected groups that might be returning to the area. We made it 3 blocks from the house before encountering our first infected patrol since beginning the evacuation. Thompson's diversion had been successful in drawing most of the infected away from our immediate area, but some had remained or returned early, and they were conducting searches that would inevitably discover our escape route. We had to find concealment quickly while also continuing Sophie's medical treatment. I found temporary shelter in an abandoned pharmacy where I could continue treating Sophie while we waited for the infected patrol to pass. The pharmacy had been looted, but there were still some medical supplies that could be useful for Sophie's treatment. More importantly, the building had multiple exit routes that would allow us to continue our evacuation if we were discovered. While we were sheltering in the pharmacy, Sophie's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly than I'd anticipated. The medications that had been effective earlier were becoming less successful at controlling her symptoms, and she was entering what appeared to be the second stage of infection. I had to make decisions about her treatment that could determine whether she survived or transformed. Emma watched me treating Sophie and asked the question that I'd been dreading since finding them alive. She wanted to know if Sophie was going to die, and if there was anything I could do to save her. I had to be honest about Sophie's condition while also maintaining Emma's hope and cooperation, because giving up on Sophie would mean losing both of my daughters to this outbreak. I administered what I knew might be my last effective dose of medication to Sophie, using a combination of anesthetics and experimental drugs that Dr. Williams had prepared specifically for advanced cases of infection. Sophie's response was minimal, and I realized that I was reaching the limits of what I could accomplish with the medical resources I had available. The decision I made in that pharmacy would define the rest of my life and determine whether I could save at least one of my daughters. Sophie was entering the final stages of transformation, and continuing to treat her would consume resources and time that might be essential for getting Emma to safety. But abandoning Sophie would mean accepting that I'd failed to save both of my children from the outbreak. Emma made the decision for me by taking Sophie's hand and telling her that she loved her, and that she wanted her to be comfortable and not afraid. She understood what was happening better than I'd realized, and she was prepared to say goodbye to her sister if that was what was necessary. Emma's maturity and courage in that moment reminded me why I'd been fighting so hard to reach them. I prepared a final dose of morphine that would ease Sophie's transition and prevent her from experiencing the pain and terror of transformation. It was the same decision I'd made with Maria, but this time it was my own daughter, and the weight of that choice nearly broke me. Sophie died peacefully, surrounded by people who loved her, instead of transforming into something that would have tried to kill her sister. Emma and I left the pharmacy carrying Sophie's body, because Emma insisted that we couldn't leave her sister in a place where infected people might find her. We found a small park where we could bury Sophie properly, and Emma said a few words that honored her sister's courage and love. It was the first funeral of the outbreak, and it wouldn't be the last. The journey from Lincoln Park to Northwestern University took us 18 hours of careful travel through infected territory. But we made it safely because Emma had learned skills during her 3 days of survival that complemented my medical knowledge and tactical experience. She could identify infected behavior patterns, navigate through dangerous areas, and make survival decisions that kept us both alive. When we reached Northwestern University, the survivors there welcomed us and provided medical care for both of us. Emma was physically healthy but emotionally traumatized by everything she'd experienced, and I was dealing with exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological impact of losing Sophie. But we were alive, and we were together, and that was more than most families could say after 72 hours of the outbreak. The Northwestern group had continued their research into the infection, and they'd made discoveries that provided hope for developing effective treatments. They'd identified medications that could prevent infection if administered before exposure, and they'd developed protocols for slowing progression in early-stage cases. Sophie's death had contributed to their understanding, because the treatments I'd attempted had provided valuable data about medication effectiveness. Dr. Williams had established a medical station where survivors could receive treatment for injuries and illnesses, and where we could train people in basic medical procedures that might save lives during future emergencies. I volunteered to help with this effort, using my experience from treating infected patients to develop better protocols for early intervention and symptom management. Emma surprised everyone by volunteering to help with survivor rescue operations, using the skills she developed during her 3 days of independent survival to guide rescue teams through infected territory. Her knowledge of infected behavior patterns and defensive strategies made her invaluable for planning operations in areas that were too dangerous for adults to navigate successfully. The northwestern safe zone became our permanent base, but it was also our launching point for expanding rescue operations and research efforts throughout the city. We'd learned that survival was possible with the right knowledge, medical supplies, and tactical planning. But we'd also learned that the infected represented a permanent change to human civilization that would require completely new approaches to medicine and survival. 3 months after the outbreak began, we'd established a network of safe zones throughout Chicago and had developed medical protocols that could prevent infection and treat early-stage cases effectively. Emma had become one of our most successful rescue coordinators, and I had become the medical director for our entire survivor network. We'd saved hundreds of people, but we'd also lost many others, including Sophie and Thompson and Maria, and countless others whose names I'll never know. The outbreak taught me that medicine isn't just about treating diseases and injuries. It's about making impossible choices under extreme pressure and living with the consequences of those decisions. I'd saved Emma, but I'd failed to save Sophie. I'd helped establish survivor communities, but I'd also had to watch people I cared about transform into something that wanted to kill me. The line between medical treatment and mercy killing had disappeared completely. Today, we're still fighting to reclaim Chicago from the infected populations, but we're also learning to coexist with them in ways that previous generations of medical professionals never could have imagined. Some infected people retain enough human consciousness to communicate and cooperate, while others are completely transformed and must be treated as threats. The complexity of this new reality requires medical and ethical frameworks that didn't exist before the outbreak. Emma is now 16 years old, and she's become one of the most experienced survivor rescue specialists in our network. She's saved more lives than most adults, and she's developed survival skills that will serve her well in this new world we're all learning to navigate. She still misses Sophie every day, but she's also found purpose in helping other families survive what we survived. I'm still Dr. Von Kowalski, but I'm no longer just an anesthesiologist who keeps people unconscious during surgery. I'm a survivor who learned that medicine in an apocalyptic world requires skills that no medical school ever taught, and moral flexibility that challenges everything I thought I knew about helping people. The oath to do no harm has become infinitely more complicated when harm and help sometimes look exactly the same. The outbreak continues, but so do we. Every day brings new challenges and new opportunities to save lives, and every day brings new ethical dilemmas that force us to redefine what it means to be human in a world where humanity itself has been fundamentally altered. We're not just surviving anymore. We're rebuilding civilization with the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about medicine, survival, and human nature was incomplete. This is our story, but it's also just the beginning of a much longer story about how humanity adapts when everything changes overnight. We're 3 years into the outbreak now, and we're still learning, still fighting, still hoping that tomorrow will be better than today. The world ended 72 hours after it began, but we're still here, and we're still human, and that has to be enough.